Well, hi there, I'm Noah Bradley and this is Handmade House TV. On today's episode, we're going to talk about something critical in the process of building your home. It's extremely important, and that is how to properly cover the materials that you have on site. So stay tuned. On today's Handmade House TV, I wanted to share with you some tips and secrets and insights that I've garnered through 30 or 40 years now of working with an excess amount of materials, of building houses, of having more material than I have a roof to put it underneath, and the proper technique of doing your best to protect and preserve your materials, which means keeping them dry, which means that you need some kind of temporary cover over top of it. And I've seen many individuals who, matter of fact, I've seen very few who have ever done a good job at covering materials. And there are just a few good pointers that I could pass on to you with regard to taking care of your materials. And first of all, probably the best solution you can find as far as a plastic cover over top of it. There are the farm tarps that tend to leak. There are some high caliber rubber ones out there, but they're extremely expensive. And so probably the best solution that I can offer you is to get some sheet plastic at your local hardware store or building supply store. Now, what I recommend as far as plastic goes is, first of all, black plastic versus clear plastic. Clear plastic has a tendency to break down under sunshine and break into just a million little pieces that are almost impossible to clean up. In less than a year's time, it's totally worthless. Plus, it has more of a solar effect, that the sun shines through the plastic and tends to heat up things, steam things, and makes your wood moister than it should be, hotter than it should be. The only advantage to clear plastic is the fact that you can see through the plastic to see what you want, but sometimes we don't really want to see that. Our piles tend to be a little bit of an eyesore on a job site. It never fails that we end up with plenty of piles, and it's not the most attractive thing. So an attractively covered pile is a good way to go. And so black plastic is the thing. Next of all, make sure and get 6 mil plastic instead of 4 mil plastic. 6 mil is much thicker, more durable than 4 mil. Obviously, it costs a little bit more, but it's well worth it. It's much more durable product and will hold up much more better long term than what 4 mil will. Typically, when I buy plastic, I go ahead and I get a sheet that is 20 feet wide and 100 feet long. I find that if I go with anything smaller than this, that it never fails. I end up with a lot of plastic that's just too small, too impractical to do the job. When a lot of lumber that you're going to use in the process of your home is right around 16 feet, it's amazing how often that number tends to pop up. And so if you get 20 foot, you'll have enough to cover anything longer than that. You'll have enough to cover the ends really well. That's the product to go with, is to get you a roll. And chances are one roll, 20 foot by 100 foot black plastic will last you your entire job site, your entire construction of that particular home. So it's likely a one-time purchase. Now, the next thing about plastic is that whenever you have a pile of lumber, you don't want to lay it directly on the ground. The ground is wet, the ground is moist. It is dirty. The moisture will come up. So you want to get your lumber up off of the ground, and that is you can just use a few pieces of heavy timbers on the bottom, or in this case I've got extra stone here that I've just piled my lumber pile on top of the stone. It allows it to get up off the ground, and the lumber is not soaking up all that excess moisture from the ground itself. The next thing you want to do is that when you cover your wood, you never want to cover it completely. You don't want to seal all the perimeters around the entire pile of lumber to the ground, or else the heat will build up. The moisture from the ground will come up, and it'll just be a warm, moist environment inside of there, which is going to cause your wood to expand in size. It's going to cause it to maybe mold or mildew. to stain, and eventually to rot underneath the pile. So whenever I create a pile, I do my best to allow air as much as possible to flow through the pile. So what we are creating when we are covering our pile of lumber is a roof, not a house. We want to cover the top as much as possible. And in this particular pile, and in most of the piles I create, what I've done is I've left the ends of the piles open so that air can circulate from one end of the lumber to the other, and whereas the sides are completely covered. Now, I'm a big fan of uncovering the plastic from our piles as much as possible. Whenever the weather is sunny and nice, I tend to always unfurl my plastic, and I let the lumber and everything underneath it, the plastic, to completely dry, to let the sun shine on it, to let the air circulate through it, and I make sure and I cover the pile back up at the end of the day. This really goes a long way in preserving your pile. Even with you leaving the ends open with a little bit of air circulation under there, it's still hotter and moister than the typical environment. By unfurling it, letting it bake, and then covering it back in, you will tend to have underneath your pile the driest environment on your property, not the wettest on your property, which is a good thing to have. So make sure and uncover your pile as much as possible. And if for some strange reason your pile ever leaks, if your cover ever leaks on it, or if you forget to cover it back up and it does get wet, you really need to completely unstack your pile, let all of the wood dry out thoroughly, let the area underneath the pile dry out thoroughly, and then carefully restack it all back and cover it back over with plastic. That if your wood gets wet, it's touching each other with underneath the plastic thing, it's never going to dry out, and it's just going to be a mess, and you're going to end up ruining your wood over time. The last thing that I'd like to offer is that I typically like to wrap my plastic in both sides of it in a long timber. I just roll it up a little bit, and this holds the wood a whole lot better than just having pieces of wood holding it down, or a stone or a brick. Plastic is a slippery element. You don't want to be careful when you're walking on it and it's wet. You can find yourself on the ground real fast. And if you're just counting on the weight of something to hold the plastic down, very likely that a strong wind is going to be able to pull that plastic off and carry it away. And those are the storms, those windy storms are the ones we most want to have our pile protected from. So by wrapping the plastic around a long timber on both sides, a long board on both sides, you'll do a great job at the plastic never coming off of there. And typically whenever I get a pile done, I go ahead and I always have some scrap lumber, some short pieces, some heavy pieces, some unusable pieces, and I go ahead and I just randomly pile those on top of the pile. It keeps the pile from ballooning up and potentially pulling off or tearing in the wind and everything. So a careful laying I know it looks like a mess, folks, but some careful weighting of the plastic on top of it will ensure that your pile lasts for a long time. One other thought is that you can, if you double the layer of plastic over top of your pile, well, you're using up twice as much plastic, which is kind of a shame, but you're doubling your chances that there will never be a problem on there. If one layer develops a crack or a leak in it, the other layer will catch any water that might filtrate in there. So make sure and cover your piles really well. And thank you for joining me here on Handmade House TV. We'll see you next week. Thank you so much for your comments and for your sharing and for subscribing to this channel. You guys take care. We'll see you then. Bye now.